This is Samuel. On the day he was supposed to fly to close the biggest deal of his life, he was barred at the door of his own plane and treated like an intruder, a silent humiliation, but one that screamed in his soul. Has your faith ever been tested when everything around you was telling you to explode? Before I tell you how God worked in his life when they tried to humiliate him in a place he had conquered for himself, comment here where you're watching from and go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place things in his hands. That private jet hangar was a cold place, not just in temperature but in spirit. It smelled of kerosene and a kind of luxury that pushed people away. The bright white lights reflected on the polished floor, creating a sterile, almost surgical environment where anyone who didn't fit the mold was seen as a foreign body, a bacterium to be eliminated. Samuel felt it the exact moment he set foot in there. He was wearing a grey sweatshirt, comfortable pants and sneakers, the attire of a practical man facing a 12-hour flight, not the armor of a millionaire. To the eyes of that place, he was invisible or worse, unwanted, and that feeling would only intensify. The conflict began abruptly, like an unexpected slap in the face. As he approached the imposing jet, a Gulfstream G650 that gleamed under the lights, he saw a man, the pilot, exit the aircraft and position himself at the top of the stairs, like a sentinel. Captain Furtado's gaze scanned Samuel from head to toe, and a slight curl of his lips in disdain was the first assault. Samuel, with his natural calm, simply nodded, expecting the stairs to be cleared. But the pilot didn't move. Instead, he crossed his arms, a universal gesture of a barrier, of defiance. The tension began right there, in that silence, heavy with judgment. "Can I help you?" "Sir, you must have the wrong gate. This is a private boarding area, restricted to authorized." "Passengers," said Captain Furtado, his voice laden with an authority he believed his uniform granted him. The sentence was spoken loudly enough for the ground crew just a few meters away to hear. The humiliation was designed to be public. Samuel felt the heat rise up his neck, a human and visceral reaction to injustice. He looked around and saw curious stares, some indifferent, but none supportive. In that instant, he wasn't the owner of the plane. He was just a black man in a sweatshirt in the wrong place. With the serenity that life and faith had taught him, Samuel replied without altering his tone of voice. "Good morning. There's no mistake. This is my flight." He didn't offer details, feeling no need to justify himself. The truth was simple and should have been enough. But the simplicity of the truth often offends the pride of those who live by appearances. The pilot let out a short laugh, a sound of scorn that echoed in the hangar's silence. "Your flight? My friend, I don't think you understand. To board here, you need to be the owner or have his express authorization. Where are your documents? Where is the proof that the owner even knows you exist?" With every word, the affront grew. The young flight attendant, who was watching everything from the plane's door, seemed uncomfortable. Her eyes darted away from Samuel's, a clear sign that she knew this was wrong, but her fear of her superior was greater than her conscience. The silence of the other employees was a form of complicity. They were passive witnesses, allowing the injustice to unfold without any intervention. Samuel felt the weight of that moment. It wasn't just about boarding a plane. It was about his dignity, his identity, and the faith he professed. The world was testing him, and God was watching in silence. Inside Samuel, a battle was raging. The flesh cried out for a response in kind. He could pull out his phone, show the purchase confirmation email for the jet, the aircraft's registration, in his name. He could call his manager, the airport director. He could crush that man with the weight of his bank account. Earthly power was at his fingertips, a quick and humiliating solution for Captain Furtado. It would be the reaction everyone expected. The angry outburst of a wealthy, offended man, the scene that would confirm their stereotypes of him. But another voice, lower and steadier, spoke to his spirit. The voice he heard in his early morning prayers, the one that reminded him of his late wife's words. "The strength of a man of God is not in how he retaliates, but in how he endures." He remembered a sermon from his pastor about the patience of Job, about how true victory often comes wrapped in silence and trust. To lash out would be a victory for the ego, but a defeat for the spirit. And for Samuel, the latter was the only one that truly mattered. He thought of his teenage daughter, of everything he tried to teach her about integrity, about not letting herself be defined by the judgment of others. What kind of father would he be if at the first trial he threw all that away for a moment of carnal satisfaction? This wasn't a test of his financial power, he realized. It was a test of faith, an opportunity sent by God for him to live what he preached. It was for him, not against him. That arrogant pilot and that cold hanger were just the setting for a lesson he needed to demonstrate, first to himself. So, the decision was made, not on his lips, but in his heart. He would not play their game. He would not stoop to the level of arrogance and prejudice. He would anchor himself to the rock that was his faith. He would let God himself be his advocate and judge. The silence stretched on for a few more seconds, which felt like an eternity. Captain Furtado was smiling, victorious, believing he had cornered the intruder. Little did he know that Samuel wasn't cornered. On the contrary, he had never felt so free and so strong, for his strength didn't come from a document in his pocket, but from the certainty he carried in his soul. It was then that Samuel did what no one expected. He closed his eyes for a brief instant, no more than 2 seconds, and inhaled the cold, chemical air of the hangar. When he opened them again, the frustration that had previously threatened to show on his face had dissipated, replaced by a disconcerting, almost supernatural serenity. He looked directly into Captain Furtado's eyes, without anger, without arrogance, and with a firm but gentle voice, he spoke the words that would change the atmosphere of that place. "My friend, patience is a virtue. Let's practice it together." The sentence landed in the hangar like a stone in a silent lake, creating ripples of perplexity that washed over everyone watching. Captain Furtado's reaction was a mixture of shock and fury. He had expected a shout, a threat, an argument. Samuel's calmness was a greater insult than any offense he could have uttered. For a man like Furtado, who measured the world in hierarchies and displays of power, that serenity was a language he did not understand, and therefore despised. "Are you kidding me?" he snarled, taking a step forward, invading Samuel's personal space. "You're in no position to lecture me. Either you show me the documents and authorization now, or I'm calling security to have you forcibly removed from this hangar. The choice is yours." As the pilot raised his voice, Samuel felt adrenaline pulse through his veins, a primitive instinct wanting to respond to the threat. He felt the injustice burn in his chest, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal on ground he had conquered with so much honest work and sweat. But instead of letting the feeling consume him, he turned it into a silent prayer. "Lord, give me your peace that surpasses all understanding. Do not let me fall into the enemy's trap. May your will be done, not mine." It was an intimate and immediate conversation with God, his anchor in the midst of the storm of pride and prejudice that surrounded him. The young flight attendant, who until then had remained like a frightened statue at the plane's door, took a hesitant step forward. "Captain, maybe," she began to say, her voice trembling, but was cut off by a withering glare from Furtado. The message was clear: stay out of it. She immediately retreated, her face pale with fear, but her eyes met Samuel's for a second. In that brief eye contact, he saw not contempt, but shame and helplessness. She was as much a prisoner of this situation as he was, chained by the fear of losing her job. Samuel understood, and in his heart, he felt no anger toward her, only a silent compassion. The stalemate stretched on. Time seemed to drag, dense and heavy. The only sound in the hangar was the distant hum of a generator and the echo of the pilot's arrogance which still hung in the air. The ground crew, once merely curious, now watched with an almost morbid attention, as if witnessing the first act of a play whose ending they couldn't wait to see. No one was working. No one moved. All eyes were fixed on those 2 men at the foot of the jet's stairs, one shouting his authority into the void, the other affirming his in a powerful, unshakable silence. Samuel felt each stare like a tiny needle on his skin. Losing his patience completely, Captain Furtado finally acted. He turned to the side, pulled the radio communicator from his belt with a dramatic gesture, and brought it to his mouth. "This is your last warning," he said, more to the audience than to Samuel. The click of the radio's button sounded abnormally loud in the tense environment. The threat was about to become a reality. The humiliation was about to escalate to a new level, that of forced removal, of formal accusation. This was the tipping point. Once that call was made, the consequences would be much harder to reverse. The secular world was about to crush him with its protocols and its brute force. But Samuel did not move. He did not beg, did not try to stop him. He just watched the act with an expression of deep, calm disappointment. There was a trace of sadness in his eyes, not for himself, but for the man before him. He saw an individual so trapped in his own insecurities and prejudices that he needed to diminish others to feel big. Samuel's strength at that moment was not passivity. It was an active choice to trust that the outcome was not in the hands of that pilot, nor the airport security, but in the hands of a much greater power, one that weaves justice with invisible threads. As the pilot prepared to speak, Samuel's mind traveled for an instant to his wife's hospital bed years ago. She, though weak and in her final days, had held his hand and said, "Sam, never forget that God sometimes places us in deserts not to punish us, but to teach us to find water where no one else sees it. Your greatest strength will be the faith you show when you have no human strength left." The memory filled him with a warmth that protected him from the cold of that hangar and the hostility of that man. He was in the desert now, and he was ready to see the water spring forth. Operations Center. This is Captain Furtado of Private Aircraft PT-SML. The pilot's voice sounded metallic and official over the radio. I am on Platform 7, and I have an unauthorized individual refusing to leave the restricted area. He is attempting to board the aircraft. I request a security team be sent to the location immediately. I repeat, with urgency. The call was made. The sentence was passed. The gears of the final humiliation were set in motion. The captain lowered the radio with a satisfied smirk, the smile of someone who believes they have won the battle. But in the exact instant that silence was re-established, a new sound cut through the air. It was not the sound of marching security boots, but the hurried and almost desperate sound of dress shoes running on the polished concrete. The sound came from the hallway that led to the airport administration offices. Someone was coming, and they were coming fast. The sound grew louder and louder, echoing through the vast space, a harbinger that the scene was about to be interrupted, but not in the way Captain Furtado had planned. All eyes, including the pilots, turned toward that sound of urgency. From the hangar entrance emerged a figure who instantly changed the power dynamic. It was Mr. Almeida, the airport's director of operations, a man known for his ruthless efficiency and explosive temper when things got out of control. He wasn't walking, he was practically running, his face red with exertion and worry, his tie slightly askew. His eyes swept the scene, the parked jet, the idle ground crew, and the two men at the center of it all. His expression went from concern to shock, and finally to visible dread when he recognized Samuel, completely ignoring Captain Furtado, who was still holding the radio like a trophy. Mr. Almeida addressed Samuel directly, his voice filled with a deference that bordered on pleading. "Mr. Samuel, my deepest apologies. I was on a call and didn't see that you had arrived. The flight should have already departed. We're running late. Was there a problem here? Did the team not assist you properly?" The words tumbled out in a rush of haste and nervousness. To the director, Samuel wasn't a man in a sweatshirt. He was the airport's most valuable client, the owner of the newest and most expensive acquisition to operate out of that hangar, a man whose satisfaction was vital for business. Captain Furtado's jaw didn't just drop, it plummeted. The color drained from his face, leaving him with a deathly pallor. The radio in his hand suddenly seemed to weigh a ton, and his fingers released it, letting the device fall to the ground with a dry, pathetic thud. The sound was the only noise in a hangar suddenly plunged into an absolute and crushing silence. The pilot's victorious smirk twisted into a mask of pure horror and disbelief. He looked from Samuel to the director, and back to Samuel, his mind struggling to process the devastating reality that had just crashed down upon him. The truth didn't need to be shouted. It didn't need documents or proof. It was revealed by a circumstance Samuel hadn't planned, an intervention he saw as the hand of God acting at the perfect time. Divine justice didn't come with thunder, but with the hurried steps of a director worried about his schedule. The humiliation the pilot had tried to impose on Samuel boomeranged and hit him with the force of a hurricane. The hunter had become the hunted, and the judge had just been judged. The shame in the hangar was palpable, a dense fog that suffocated everyone who had been complicit in their silence. Mr. Almeida, finally realizing the gravity of what had happened, turned to Captain Furtado. His expression of deference gave way to an icy fury. His eyes, once worried, were now two slits of restrained anger. "Furtado, what the hell do you think you are doing?" he hissed, his voice low, but carrying a threat that was 1,000 times more frightening than the pilot's earlier shouts. "This gentleman," he said, gesturing respectfully toward Samuel, "is Mr. Samuel, the owner of this aircraft, your boss. Did you just call security to remove your boss from his own plane?" The flight attendant at the jet's door brought a hand to her mouth, a sob of panic escaping. The ground crew, members who had been watching with curiosity, now averted their gazes, desperately trying to look busy, as if they could become invisible and escape the director's imminent wrath. Their world, based on uniforms and appearances, had been turned upside down. The man they had judged as insignificant was, in fact, the most important piece on the board. The lesson was harsh, immediate, and public. Man's justice was about to be executed, swift and brutal. "You're fired. Now, hand over your credentials and get out of my hangar," Mr. Almeida decreed, his voice as firm as steel. He turned to the flight attendant. "You too. I don't want anyone on my team who condones this kind of shameful and prejudiced behavior. Get your things. Your careers at this airport are over." The sentence was final. There was no room for appeal. The power Furtado had used to humiliate Samuel was now the tool of his own professional ruin. He stood paralyzed, unable to form a single word, his face a mixture of pleading and despair. But just as earthly justice seemed to have triumphed, Samuel's true test of faith began. Everyone expected him to watch the execution with a smile of satisfaction. It was his right. He had been offended, humiliated, and now his aggressors were paying the price. It would be the perfect revenge, the logical conclusion to this story of power. Anyone in his place would feel the sweet taste of retribution. Watching that captain's pride be shattered into 1,000 pieces would be the reward for the pain he had caused. However, Samuel felt no joy. Looking at Captain Furtado's face, disfigured by panic, he didn't see an enemy, but a broken man. He remembered the passage he had read that morning, from the letter to the Romans. "Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, 'It is mine to avenge, I will repay,' says the Lord." That was not his role. To judge and condemn was not his function. God had already exposed the truth and restored his honor. What he did next would define not the man he was in the eyes of the world, but the man he was in the eyes of God. With a calm gesture, Samuel raised his hand and lightly touched the arm of Mr. Almeida, who was still seething with anger. "Mr. Almeida, please wait a moment," he said, his voice as serene as before. The director turned, surprised. The confusion on his face was evident. "But, Mr. Samuel, they humiliated you. This is unacceptable. They must be punished." Samuel looked at the director, then at the trembling pilot, and then at the young flight attendant who was crying silently, and he knew what he had to do. It was not the easiest path, but it was the only path his faith allowed him to take. "The punishment has already been given," Samuel replied, with a wisdom that silenced the room once more. "The shame they feel now is a harsher lesson than any termination." He stepped away from the director and took a few slow steps toward Captain Furtado, who watched him with wide eyes, like a defendant awaiting the final verdict from the judge. The entire hangar held its breath. What would come next? A lecture? A final humiliation? No one could have predicted what was in the heart of that man in the gray sweatshirt. Samuel stopped an arm's length from the pilot, creating an uncomfortable intimacy in that vast, impersonal space. He looked into Captain Furtado's eyes, not with superiority, but with an intensity that seemed to peer into his soul. "Today you didn't see me," Samuel began, his voice low but each word resonating with immense weight. "You looked at my clothes, at the color of my skin, and you judged the packaging without caring about the contents. You didn't offend me as the owner of a plane. You offended a man, a son of God, just like you." The pilot shrank under the weight of those words. They were an accusation, but spoken without anger, which made them even sharper. "I could let Mr. Almeida destroy your career. It would be easy. Perhaps to many it would be just," Samuel continued. "But what lesson would you learn from that? Only to be more careful not to offend the wrong person, the rich man in disguise. And that is not the lesson God wants you to learn today." He paused, letting the message sink in. I don't want you to lose your job, I want that. The next time someone different from your standards stands before you, you will be able to see the person, the soul, the human being. That will be your true lesson and my only payment." A collective gasp swept through the hangar. Forgiveness was the last thing anyone there expected. It was an act so radical, so contrary to the world's logic, that it seemed like a miracle in itself. Captain Furtado, who had been braced for the final blow, crumbled. The tears he had been holding back with such effort finally rolled down his face, tears of shame, of relief, and of overwhelming incomprehension. He tried to speak, but only a choked sound came out. He opened and closed his mouth, unable to articulate the words sorry or thank you. Samuel then turned to the young flight attendant, who was looking at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. He offered her a gentle smile. "And you, young lady, learn that silence in the face of injustice makes us accomplices. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. May this serve you for the rest of your life." He did not condemn her, but taught her. He gave her a tool to be a better person, instead of a termination notice. He was restoring the dignity of everyone, including those who had tried to rob him of his. With a nod to the astonished Mr. Almeida, Samuel finally turned and climbed the steps of his jet. He did not look back. His mission in that hangar was complete. It wasn't to close a contract, but to demonstrate the power of grace. As he entered the luxurious cabin, he didn't feel the triumph of material power, but the deep peace of one who was faithful to his principles and his God. He sat in his soft leather seat, closed his eyes and said a prayer of thanks, not for having won, but for having been used. Down below, Captain Furtado remained motionless for a long time, watching the plane door close. Samuel's words echoed in his mind. He hadn't been fired, but he had been deconstructed and remade in a matter of minutes. That encounter would change his life forever. Mr. Almeida, still in shock, approached him and simply said, his voice thick with emotion, "You have no idea how lucky you are, and I'm not talking about the job." That day, for everyone present, the perception of Samuel changed from a lucky man to a man of strength, a strength that did not come from his bank account. As the jet taxied down the runway, Samuel looked out the window. He saw not just the airport lights, but the manifestation of divine providence. The injustice he suffered had been transformed into a powerful testimony. The humiliation had become an opportunity for forgiveness. He understood that sometimes God allows us to be diminished in the eyes of men, so that His glory can be exalted in a way that no display of earthly power ever could. The victory wasn't proving the plane was his, but proving that he belonged to God. The story of what happened in that hangar spread throughout the airport, not as gossip, but as a legend. The incident of the man in the sweatshirt became a cautionary tale, a reminder that appearances are deceiving, and that true authority lies not in the uniform one wears, but in the character one demonstrates. Captain Furtado was never the same. He became a quieter, more observant man, and reports say he began to treat every janitor and every billionaire with the same respect, always trying to see the person behind the packaging. That day left an indelible mark on the souls of everyone involved. For Samuel, it was the confirmation that his faith was more than words spoken in church. It was a living, active, and transformative force. For the pilot and the flight attendant, it was a second chance they didn't deserve, but received through an act of inexplicable grace. And for all who witnessed it, it was proof that God still writes stories of redemption in the most unlikely places, using ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary feats. Samuel's trip was a success. The contract was signed. But for him, the biggest deal closed that day was not the one that earned him more money, but the one that earned him more peace of mind and strengthened his walk. He learned in practice that forgiveness is not an act of weakness, but the greatest demonstration of strength a human being can possess. It is a power that disarms pride, heals wounds, and reflects the image of the Creator himself. The lesson from that day in the hangar was never forgotten. Samuel told it many times in his church, not to boast, but to testify to the power of patience and trust in God. He always ended his account with the same reflection, a truth he lived firsthand, and that resonates to this day with overwhelming force, an echo of that moment of trial and divine turnaround. The echo of that lesson still hangs in the cold air of that hangar. A reminder that human judgment is flawed and fleeting, but the justice and grace of God are eternal. Samuel's story is not just about a rich man being disrespected, but about a man of faith being tested and approved, showing that true worth is not in what one possesses. The memory of that event serves as a living testimony, the proof that God can use one man's arrogance to teach humility to many, and another's calm to demonstrate the power of forgiveness. That jet took off carrying not just a businessman, but a messenger, whose example left a lesson that no amount of money could buy. For true authority doesn't lie in owning the skies, but in having a spirit big enough to forgive those who try to keep you on the ground. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains. Thank you for listening.